What's up guys, you're watching Li-Fi TCG. Today's video is Legacy. Just recently there've been FNMs and things starting up after the pandemic. So depending on where you live, that might sound sensible or it might not, but putting that aside for a moment, the deck I've been playing is Death Shadow. If you've been a regular subscriber for a while, you'll know that this is one of the decks that I play the most in Legacy. Slightly unconventional list. I mean, pretty typical for the list that I use, but maybe a bit different to the list most commonly seen. And there's a little update from the new core set, M21, so I just thought I'd run through the changes I've made. So the threat package that I play is 4 Death Shadow, 4 Vantress Gargoyle. So typically what's seen is like 4 Delver Secrets, 4 Death Shadow, 2 Borrower and 2 Angler. I'm not playing any Delver, I'm not playing Angler or Borrower, so the deck is more threat light and it keeps that space for more interaction. And in exchange, we're playing the Gargoyles, which are like quite aggressive, 2-drop with 5 power flying, pretty easy to activate, getting your opponent having 7 cards in the graveyard is not difficult. Like it's mainly an offensive card, not really defensive. Like it's often quite difficult to block with it, the requirement of having 4 cards in hand. But like very early, like on literal turn 2, it usually is able to block, and often that's what you want, like versus Matter Reshaper or early Goblins play or something like that, and this deck can turn the corner very fast, so normally it's not too bad at all. And it's nice that it's blue, so it pitches to Force. Yeah, I'm still pretty happy with this card. There's been some mono blue kind of Delver decks popping up, and they seem to be playing a split of the Stormwing Entity and the Ethereal Forager, the Delve Whale. They play like two each of those cards. So the Delve Whale sort of competes with some sideboard cards that we're playing, so I'll get into that when we get to that. And Storming Entity is like pretty decent, but those decks are playing like 3 or 4 copies of Gutshot main deck to enable it, which I think is like a pretty suboptimal choice. I mean, like this is probably as good a time as any to be playing Gutshot, because like it kills Delver and the Delver pseudo mirrors. It's good against Goblins, it's good against Elves, it's good against like Esper Vial as well, so maybe it's not that bad, but it still seems like kind of loose. It's like a very weak card overall. And the difference between these decks and those kind of mono blue Delver decks is that the mono blue decks don't do a very good job of putting cards in the opponent's graveyard, because instead of playing cards like Thoughtseize and him to Tourach, they're playing stuff like Vapor Snag or whatever, so they're just not as good at destroying or discarding the opponent's cards. Like they don't have actual removal like Fatal Push or whatever either, so yeah, this is like a good spot for the Gargoyle, I think. Then 4 Street Wraith is pretty standard to help enable the Shadow plan. So, and then the last 2 creatures are new as well. I'm playing 2 Baleful Strix main deck. So I trimmed, there was always like 1 flick slot in the deck, which was always like a Preordain or whatever random card. So that one of those became a Baleful Strix. And I think I cut 1 of the main deck counterspells as well. Like I used to always play 1 Stubborn Denial. And now one of those is a Strix as well. So the thing with the Strix, like there were a lot of situations where I felt I wanted more removal, because I felt like there were a few games I was losing where I was just getting run over too early. Like in some matchups, the discard you play, like the Thoughtseize and the Hymn to Tourach, like the tempo loss was just too great. Coupled with the fact that like Vantress isn't that good at blocking and you just sort of got steamrolled a bit too easily. But at the same time, I didn't want to really put any more removal spells in the deck. Like that's the nice thing about playing bolts in normal Delver, is that normal Delver, you know what I mean, like Rug Delver, the most popular version. They get to play like more slots on that early removal, because in the late game it can help to close out the game just by burning face, but the black removal doesn't do that. Like if we had more Fatal Push or Snuff Out or whatever, like in combo matchups, it's just useless. So Baleful Strix does a nice job of being removal, anti-aggro removal, but also it's a cantrip, so it's not dead in any matchup, and it's blue, so it pitches to force and blah blah blah. So yeah, I've been pretty critical of the idea of playing this card in the past, but I think this version of the deck without Delver, I think it makes a lot of sense. So yeah, 2 of the Strix. I'm playing 4 Hymn to Tourach main. This might not look so smart in like the post Veil of Summer era, but the card is still fine, but you just have to be willing to fight over it. Like it's not going to be good in a kind of Grixis control plan where your plan is to just go like turn 1 Thoughtseize, turn 2 Hymn to Tourach, turn 3 Kolaghan's Command, turn 4 like snap Hymn to Tourach or whatever, and like your only backup for that is like your 4 Force of Will in the deck, because it's going to be very hard for you to interact if your opponent like veils you at any point in that chain, and then you just start to fall behind. But when you have like 4 Daze in your deck as well, and you're like pressuring your opponent with Wastelands and things, then it becomes a lot more difficult for your opponent to veil your spells. So I think him is still fine, and it helps to play into that like Grixis control plan, Grixis control-esque plan that this deck is trying to go for, where it just trades resources very efficiently, helps to put cards in your graveyard to make your Gargoyle activate. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with playing the 4 him still, and then the rest is just like mostly stock. Blue-black shadow cards, so 4 Thoughtseize, 4 Brainstorm, 4 Ponder, 4 Daze, 4 Force of Will. Very typical for the deck. Then the last few spells I'm playing, the 5th Force, 1 Force of Negation. So I used to play 2 Stubborn Denial main deck, but as mentioned just before, I cut 1 for the Strix and I cut another 1 for this Force. And then 3 removal spells, 1 Fatal Push, 1 Dismember, 1 Snuff Out. So I like to have a mix of these because they all do like slightly different roles. Snuff Out, the tempo is really strong, obviously, because it destroys any creature for no mana, but often the life loss is pretty steep. Dismember gives you the flexibility of like sometimes paying a lot of life, sometimes not. And Snuff Out doesn't work on black creatures as well, which is awkward sometimes, whereas Dismember works on all creatures. And sometimes you just want an option that doesn't cost you life, especially when you're trying to remove things that are aggroing you down. So push is a good option to have as well. Depending on your metagame, you could adjust this mix to your own preference. And then the rest is just the lands. So 4 Wastelands, 2 Underground Seas, 4 Watery Graves, and then the 8 Fetchlands, all blue. I think a lot of the Rug Delver decks are playing 19 lands now, You could do that in this deck too if you wanted, but it's less. In some ways, like this deck is relatively more controlling because it doesn't have one drop threats in it. So in that case, you kind of is an argument for playing more lands because you need to play out your land drops more often. It's harder for you to survive or execute a game plan with exactly one land, but at the same time you don't have the 3 drops to like reward you for playing out so many lands. So it's a little bit of a close call, but if you wanted to add another land to go up to 19, I wouldn't strongly object to that. Then the sideboard, so 2 Ratchet Bomb, just like the catch-all answer for like Chalice of the Void decks and like weird prison things. Pretty typical. The Cruel Bargain plan, so I've got 1 Infernal Contract, 1 Cruel Bargain, 1 Mystic Sanctuary. As you'll previously have seen, this is like my version of Hans Jacob Goddick's idea from Grixis Delver, where he did this with Painful Truths. Of course, you can't make Painful Truths work in this deck because it's only 2 colors, so you don't get the full benefit of the, I can't even remember what that mechanic's called, like Converge or whatever, where you need to pay 3 colors into it to draw 3 cards. But Cruel Bargain is basically just as good, if not better, because you draw 4 cards, and every mana source in this deck makes black mana anyway, so you're fine. So this is just basically like dropping the hammer versus the control decks. You like fight over the early game with your him and stuff, and then the game gets to a point where both players are kind of low on resources, except maybe you have a few lands. Then you fire off one of these. It's pretty difficult for those decks to counter because Veil doesn't interact with it, Pyro doesn't interact with it. They basically have to have like Force of Negation or Dovin's Veto or something. And often these kind of decks like try to board out those kind of cards versus you because they don't want to have the card disadvantage. They're just trying to interact 1 for 1. So this resolves, and it puts you so far ahead that from that point you can normally just comfortably like Force of Will or Thoughtseize, whatever, anything that they present from that point onwards, while you just play a shadow and kill them. So the reason why, the alternative to playing cards like this, and the most popular thing to do in Shadow at the moment in like the stock lists, seems to be playing Winter Orb, and I'm really not a fan of that card in Delver decks in general at the moment, because every blue deck player has figured out that they can just play Carpet of Flowers in the sideboard, and it basically just negates it. Like they get the free mana from the carpet every turn. So they can easily play out all their spells, and the Winter Orb doesn't really affect them that much. I much prefer this strategy instead, I think. So yeah, that's the that part of the sideboard. Then we have 2 Plague Engineers and 2 Liliana the Last Hope. So both of these cards have a kind of similar role in that they kill creatures that have 1 toughness. The Liliana is more of an anti-control card as well, because it threatens with the emblem, and you get card advantage off of the -2 ability as well. And then Plague Engineer is less good against control matchups because it's not a very powerful threat, and it can die pretty easily. But versus things like Eldrazi, it's just the fact that it's a 2/2 death touch is pretty solid. I'm talking about that version of Eldrazi that plays like Mimic and Endless One and stuff. And then also when you're playing against a deck like Elves, often wiping everything at once is much better than Liliana that can only kill 1 thing per turn, but they're both obviously very good cards in those matchups. And like I said before when I was talking about Gutshot, this seems to be a meta game where like one toughness creatures are pretty prevalent, like goblins, Esper Vile, elves, all pretty strong decks right now. So I'm not too unhappy playing all 4 of these. Then 1 extra Force of Negation and Surgical Extraction, just to have better game versus like different kinds of combo decks. You don't really have that many cards to board out for these matchups because you're already playing like 4 Hunter Tourach, 4 Thoughtseize, 5 Force of Wills, Daze, etc. main deck. But like you do have those Strix, which are a little bit slow, and especially those removal spells that are basically just like Doom Blades that don't really do anything versus combo decks. So you don't really need to have too many cards to board in those matchups, but extra Force of Will and then things like Surgical are basically what you wouldn't need, so that's what those are there for. So these are the newer cards for the deck. So we have 2 Cling to Dust. This is from Theros Beyond Death. So what this does, it's a 1 mana instant exile target card from a graveyard, so it's like Coffin Purge kind of. If you exiled a non-creature, you draw a card, and if you exile a creature, you gain 3 life. And then it also has the text Escape, 3 under black, exile 5 other cards from a graveyard. So this is like flashback that you can do repeatedly, like like Uro or Underworld Breach. That everybody knows this mechanic by now. So 4 mana and 5 cards. So what this does, first of all, it's fine. It's just like an anti-graveyard combo thing. Like they try and reanimate the Gristlebrand, you pay black and you exile it. Obviously that's not quite as good as Surgical Extraction because well, first of all, obviously because it costs mana, and second of all because it makes you gain life, which is not really what you want to be doing in those kind of matchups. But obviously it's still fine in that situation. You'd be happy to counter the reanimate or whatever. But the main reason this card, well, there are 2 main reasons actually. The first thing is that all of your main deck is already quite good versus Delver, and they're like Delver mirrors. Like the removal spells are good. Force of Negation is like a bit iffy, so we can consider boarding that out. You usually want to keep all of your forces in this current legacy environment because the tempo is just too important. Even though it's card disadvantage, and this sort of like flies in the face of conventional wisdom from a long time ago, but I think most players have started to accept this now. Likewise, you're basically always leaving your Dazes in. Cantrips never get boarded out. Thoughtseize is pretty good. Him is actually quite fine, I think, in the Delver Mirror. Like maybe on the draw it's a bit slow, but on the play I think it's still fine. Strix is obviously great. Street Wraith is like probably the worst card. Usually you don't want to be taking the aggro roll like that. Gargoyle is fine just because it's a threat and it's early in the game, it can block well. Shadow is obviously great. So like you have about 4 or 5 cards to board out, mainly just the Street Wraiths. And arguably the Force of Negation and the Hunter Tourachs. So you do have like some good cards to board in, but not that many. So Ratchet Bomb is not super exciting because the best thing it can do is basically kill 1-drop or 2-drop creatures, which you have a lot of in the deck as well. So that's kind of awkward. The Cruel Bargain, and this is obviously crap in that matchup. You don't want it at all. Surgical doesn't do anything. Like some people go for that cheeky plan of trying to surgical their jewel lands, but that's not something I really want to try. Then Force of Negation is the card that we consider boarding out because often creatures are the things you want to be fighting over, so that's not something we really want to board in. And like these Plague Engineers and Lilianas can be fine, but typically the decks are moving away from things like Young Pyro, so often Liliana doesn't really have things that it kills. like if you can resolve it, down tick it, like bring back a Strix or something, that's can be pretty good. So that's can be worth considering. But again, like 3-drops in the Wasteland mirrors are kind of expensive. What Plague Engineer has a similar problem that it's a 3-drop, so that's not great. The other thing is that like you can just play it and then your opponent can just bolt it and you get no value out of it. So for a 3-drop, that's not very good either. So you're kind of looking for cards just to board your Wraiths out. So like the ideal thing might just be like some more removal spells, but you don't really want to play like a bunch of removal in your sideboard. And actually, well, like that's what these 2 cards are anyway, so you already kind of have that covered. The nice thing about Cling to Dust in this matchup is that like early game it's a thing that just cycles, and occasionally you can get some like cheeky situation where you counter their first Dreadhorde Arcanist trigger or something with it. So it just cycles, and then in the late game, if the game gets to that point where like both players are kind of flooded on lands, like this will just let you pull ahead so easily, like very, very quickly. Having like basically unlimited think twices out of your graveyard. Like if you flashback this twice, then you're so far ahead, and like you can use it either to draw cards or as like anti-lightning bolt insurance in that matchup. And all you had to do was like board out another cycler that you didn't really want to have anyway. So it's pretty nice that it is good in that matchup, while being good against the graveyard decks. So like targeting like Gristlebrand or Life from the Loam with this is obviously quite nice. And then it also helps you grind in like the way more controlling matchups, like the matchups where you're boarding this in. Like in some ways it's just additional copies of this kind of like mega card draw effect, but it also helps you fight over things like Uro a lot better. And again, life gain, even though your deck is mostly focused around damaging itself, life gain can be pretty strong. Like if you Infernal Contract yourself down to like 1 or 2 life, now you get to the point where you can't like fetch or Force of Will anymore. So just being able to like gain a tiny boost of life in the late game can matter a lot as well. So yeah, it's a sideboard slot you can use versus Delver, you can use versus Control, and versus like any graveyard combo deck. So it provides a lot of flexibility in only 2 sideboard slots. So I've been pretty impressed with this so far, actually. I think it does a really good job. And the sweet thing about this is that you can mill it off with the Gargoyle, which comes up sometimes. So your Gargoyle can put this into the graveyard, and it also helps to feed the escape, because you need to exile 5 other cards. And the last 2 cards are just like those 2 removal spells I was talking about. So for a long time I played Liliana's Triumph in these slots, which was like just decent in the matchups where you needed any random extra removal, but it was the fact that it was an edict was like quite nice versus Dark Depths in particular. And then that also mattered sometimes versus cards like True Name Nemesis, for example. So the reason why I'm not playing that anymore, not playing the Edict, now I'm playing to Eliminate, just because being able to kill Planeswalkers with it is too important. Oko is obviously the big one. The other thing I've run into recently is Dak Vaden. People trying like Yorion, or with or without Yorion, but I mean the Strifo variants. Killing Dak Vaden there is pretty solid. Yeah, that's basically it. And like the Edict isn't so great versus depth because a lot of them are on the like medium depths, quote unquote, now that's playing like Reclaimer and Bob and stuff, so they often have extra creatures to sack to protect their Merit Lage anyway. A lot of the reason why you wanted Edict was for specifically True Name, which is a card that nobody plays anymore, so you don't need it for that. Yeah, Eliminate is basically just better in most ways. And then, for example, like against Delver, like if your opponent has like Arcanist and Delver of Secrets and you Edict them and they get to sack their 1-drop, that's like pretty bad for you. Being able to target down exactly the thing that you want is often a much better thing to be doing in that situation. Also, matchups like Goblins and Elves, the Edict is very bad because they like flood the board with cheap creatures, and you don't want to be giving them the choice about which one to get rid of. So yeah, at the Eliminate seems like the much better option at the moment, and I think it's likely going to be the case for a while. If you have like a very hard meta read, you can play like Submerge in the slot instead, because it's pretty solid versus Rug and Elves. But overall, I think the Eliminate is just in general, like being able to kill Oko, I think puts it over the top. Yeah, so that's the deck. I hope you guys like that. I got a few other ideas in the works for future videos. So Death Shadow in Modern actually is the deck that I 3-0'd another FNM with this week. I live in a very like densely populated country, so there's like tournaments in different places within like half an hour of where I live every day. So I played a bit of Legacy, a bit of Modern. Yeah, I 3-0'd with Jund Shadow in Modern, the like aggro zoo version with all the pump spells, not the one with push and Inquisition main. So yeah, that was a fun deck. It obviously plays very different to this kind of Shadow deck, but I might do a video on that once I get the rest of the sideboard cards, because I was just basically playing with like a random sideboard of cards from my binder. Then in Pauper, like the Tron deck has like changed a little bit since my last video, and it's got some new cards, like the Double Masters downshifts affected that deck a little bit. Then Tortured Existence also got affected by the Double Masters downshifts, I think, plus Llanowar Visionary from M21. Both of those have a pretty significant both of those sets provide pretty significant upgrades for that deck, I think. Then in other Legacy decks, I'd like the Bant Miracles list that Stefano won the Showcase Challenge with, but I don't really have anything constructive to add to that. Like he knows what he's doing with that a lot more than me, so I'm not going to try and put my own spin on that. But other Legacy decks, the Blue-White Sagas deck I think is really interesting right now. Well, it's not really necessarily any more interesting than the last time I tried it, but that deck is really good at flipping 3s off a counterbalance, and that's kind of an interesting spot to be in the format right now. So I might try and take that out for a spin soon. I just need to get 2 Sabine's Reclamations, which I don't own at the moment, to finish that up. Because yeah, the last time I tried that deck, I did think it was really strong, but the like in-game replenish plan was just way too greedy. So yeah, I'm not really about that version of the deck, but I think the flickering enchantment, what's it called? Estrid's Invocation, is just like very, very powerful, and I think they History of Benalia is a good way to abuse that. So if I can play some events with that deck, I might make a video about that next as well. So yeah, that's all for today. I hope you can Death Shadow or Gargoyle some people in your near future. This has been Life TCG signing out.